Two photographs. Paris, 1936. The same tennis tournament. The same player listed in the draw sheets. The same woman named June Mercer. Except they're not the same woman at all. Look closely at the photograph on the left, the one from the quarterfinal match at Roland Garros. May 28. High cheekbones. Narrow-set eyes. A distinctive widow's peak clearly visible beneath her tennis visor. Now the photograph on the right, the semi-final. Just 3 days later. May 31st. Broader face. Eyes set wider apart. Hairline completely different. Same tournament. Same name in the official records. Different person. This is the June Mercer case. A story that exists in the margins of sports history and the footnotes of pre-war intelligence operations. A theory about substitution. About borders and identity. About a promising young athlete who may have been something else entirely. Or about nothing more than bad photography and the human tendency to see patterns in shadows. We may never know which, but the story itself, that's worth telling. To understand why this theory persists, why it could have happened, you need to understand 1936. Europe is 3 years from war, but everyone already knows it's coming. The Spanish Civil War has turned the Iberian Peninsula into a proving ground for tanks and terror bombing. Mussolini is in Ethiopia. Hitler has remilitarized the Rhineland. And intelligence services across the continent are scrambling, improvising, building networks out of whatever material comes to hand. Athletes are perfect. Think about it. They travel internationally with legitimate paperwork. They carry equipment bags that customs agents rarely search thoroughly. They have reasons to meet with local coaches, sponsors, embassy officials arranging exhibitions. And in the 1930s, before the security apparatus of the Cold War, before metal detectors and watch lists, an athlete with the right passport could move through Europe like water. Women's tennis, specifically, offered unique opportunities. This is still an era when women's international travel was restricted, scrutinized, often required male chaperones or letters of permission. But a tennis player, she had tournaments, she had contracts. She had a reason to be in Paris, in Berlin, in Prague, moving through capital cities while carrying nothing more suspicious than a racket and her credentials. June Mercer was ranked 37th in the world in 1936, promising but not prominent, good enough to draw invitations to European tournaments, not famous enough that her face would be recognized by every customs agent and sports journalist on the continent. The perfect profile, in other words, for someone who needed to be both visible and invisible. If, and this is a very large if, you were running an intelligence operation that required moving people or materials across increasingly hostile borders. If you needed couriers who could explain their presence in Vienna 1 week and Warsaw the next. If you needed covers that were boring, legitimate, and beneath suspicion, you might look at the women's tennis circuit with considerable interest. Let's return to those photographs, because everything in this story hinges on what you see when you look at them. The first image, May 28, 1936, quarter-final round, comes from Le Figaro's sports section. It's not a professional portrait, it's a candid shot, taken courtside, slightly blurred. June Mercer is mid-serve, her face turned 3/4 to the camera. You can see the bone structure clearly, those high, sharp cheekbones, the narrow bridge of her nose, the widow's peak of dark hair. The second image, May 31st, semi-final, ran in Paris Soir. This one is clearer, better lit, taken during a break between games. The woman identified as June Mercer is sitting on a bench, toweling off, and her face is different, not subtly different, not, maybe the lighting, different, structurally different. Rounder face, wider set eyes, no widow's peak, her hairline runs straight across her forehead, even the shape of her jaw is distinct. Now, here's where we have to be careful. Photographic technology in 1936 was not what we have now. Film grain, exposure times, lens distortions, all of these could create apparent differences that aren't real. Different newspapers use different photographers with different equipment. Action shots versus posed shots. Outdoor light versus indoor. The angle of the camera, these factors matter. But forensic analysis, conducted decades later by researchers who became obsessed with this case, suggests something more than photographic artifacts. Using facial recognition software designed for historical images, accounting for period camera limitations, they found discrepancies in bone structure that shouldn't vary. The distance between the eyes, the angle of the jawline. These are skeletal features that don't change based on lighting. The analysis isn't definitive. It can't be, working from 90-year-old newspaper prints, but it's suggestive enough that the question remains, are we looking at the same person, or are we looking at a substitution? And if it is a substitution, who was the other woman, and what was she carrying when she crossed those borders under June Mercer's name? Here's what we know about the real June Mercer, or rather, here's what the records tell us, which may or may not be the same thing. Born 1914, in Bristol, England. Father was a naval officer. Mother ran a boarding house near the docks. June showed athletic promise early, county-level tennis by age 15, national junior championships at 17. By 1933, she's playing the European circuit, picking up wins at minor tournaments in Lyon, Brussels, Antwerp. Not spectacular, but steady, climbing. She signs with a sports management firm in 1935, details are scarce, but the firm is listed in London business directories as Pemberton Associates, athletic representation. And here's where things get interesting. Pemberton Associates shared office space with a consulting firm called Lydian Services. No website. Obviously, this is 1935, but also no advertisements. No listed clients. No public-facing business whatsoever. Lydian Services was what's called a brass plate company, a name on a door, a receptionist who answered the phone, and behind that, nothing you could pin down. After the war, declassified MI6 documents mention Lydian Services twice, once in a budget memo, once in a personnel file. Both references are heavily redacted, but the context suggests what historians politely call a private contractor with government associations. June Mercer's coach during her 1936 to 1938 European campaigns was a man named Malcolm Hendry, Scottish, late 40s, had coached mid-tier players for years, unremarkable, except that Hendry was also listed as a logistics consultant for Lydian Services, and except that in the summer of 1937, he traveled to Berlin for a tennis clinic that no German sports organization has any record of, and except that he was in Prague in March 1938, 3 days before the Nazi occupation, ostensibly to scout venues for a tournament that was never held. None of this proves anything. Coaches travel, firms have side businesses, coincidences happen. But when you map Hendry's travel itinerary against June Mercer's tournament schedule, when you notice that they were in the same cities at the same times, but often not at the same events, when you find that June's draw sheets sometimes show her present for matches she's documented as having lost, suggesting someone played under her name while she was elsewhere, the pattern starts to look less like coincidence and more like design. Malcolm Hendry died in 1952, in Edinburgh, of a heart attack. He left no diary, no memoir, no deathbed confession. His obituary in The Scotsman described him as a dedicated coach who brought several young players to international prominence. June Mercer was not among the players mentioned. But there's a photograph. 1937. Location unknown. It surfaced in an estate sale in the 1990s, part of a box of documents labeled Hendry Papers. The photograph shows Hendry and two women in tennis whites, standing outside what researchers later identified as a hotel in Vienna. One of the women is labeled on the back as J. Mercer. The other is unlabeled. They look similar. Similar enough to be sisters, or to be chosen for their resemblance. Similar enough that, in the grainy action shots of a tennis match, with period camera equipment and newsprint reproduction, you might not notice the differences, unless you put the photographs side by side and looked closely. The theory, and let's be clear, this is speculation built on circumstantial fragments, is that Hendry was running a substitution operation, that June Mercer and at least one other woman, possibly more, were rotating through tournament appearances, that while one played under Mercer's name and maintained her public presence, the other traveled under a different identity, carrying whatever needed to be carried, meeting whoever needed to be met. Why tennis players? Because they had the paperwork. Tournament invitations, travel visas, letters from sponsors, Because customs agents in 1937 didn't scrutinize athletes the way they scrutinized businessmen or journalists. Because a woman traveling alone raised questions. But a woman traveling to play tennis at Roland Garros was boring, legitimate, beneath suspicion. The intelligence that might have been smuggled this way wouldn't have been dramatic. No stolen blueprints. No secret codes. More likely, cash payments to operatives who couldn't access banks. Messages too sensitive for cables or diplomatic pouches. The names and safe house addresses of resistance networks being built in anticipation of war. Information that could fit in a tennis bag, hidden in the frame of a racket or the lining of a shoe. And if you were caught, if customs in Prague or Berlin opened your bag and found something you couldn't explain, you were a tennis player. Young, female, English. You expressed shock, confusion, claimed someone must have planted it. And the diplomatic corps would rally, because you were a Commonwealth athlete, because the optics of arresting a sportswoman were poor, because in 1937 the war hadn't started yet and government still worried about appearances. It's a perfect cover, if it existed, which we cannot prove. June Mercer played her last documented match in June 1938, a second-round loss at Eastbourne, a minor grass court tournament on the English coast. She was 24 years old. Still ranked in the top 50, still under contract with Pemberton Associates for another 2 years. And then she vanished from tennis entirely. No retirement announcement, no injury reported in the press, no marriage notice, no career change, no indication of why a young player with years of competitive life left would simply stop. Her name disappears from tournament draws, from rankings, from the sports pages. Pemberton Associates dissolved in late 1938, Lydian Services closed its office. Malcolm Hendry returned to Scotland and coached local juniors for the next 14 years, never mentioning his European travels, never coaching another international player. In 1947, a woman named June Hendry, note the surname, registered a death certificate in Bristol. The records list her birth year as 1914, her birthplace as Bristol, and her occupation as former athlete. The informant who registered the death was listed as M. Hendry, associate. The burial was private, no obituary ran. Is June Hendry the same person as June Mercer? Possibly. Marriage records from the war years are incomplete, and Hendry is common enough that the connection could be coincidence. But the birth year matches, the birthplace matches, and the informant's initial matches Malcolm Hendry, the coach. If they're the same person, it raises questions. Why the name change? Why the silence? Why did a woman who spent her early 20s traveling Europe, playing tournaments, building a career, spend the next 9 years leaving no trace in the public record before dying at 33? The theory, and again, this is speculation, is that June Mercer knew too much. That whatever operation she was part of, willing or otherwise, created liabilities that outlasted the war. That intelligence services, even friendly ones, have a long history of cutting loose the people who know where the bodies are buried. But there's another possibility, equally plausible and far less sinister. That June Mercer simply got tired. That she married, changed her name, lived a quiet life. That she died young of illness or accident. And the gaps in the record are just gaps, not conspiracies. That we're constructing a thriller out of what amounts to bad record-keeping and the normal disappearances that happen when a minor athlete stops being newsworthy. Both versions are possible, only one involves espionage, but we can't know which is true. Let's consider the simplest explanation. The photographs show the same person, and the apparent differences are artifacts of period photography, reproduction quality, and our pattern-seeking brains. Facial recognition software is impressive. But it's not magic. Feed it 2 grainy 1936 newspaper photographs, and it's working with fragmentary data, making probabilistic guesses. The discrepancies it identifies could be lens distortion, could be the difference between a candid action shot and a posed portrait, could be confirmation bias in the researchers who wanted to find a mystery. June Mercer could have stopped playing tennis for a dozen boring reasons. Injury that wasn't dramatic enough to make the papers. Financial trouble. Loss of sponsorship, family obligations. Maybe she simply wasn't good enough to break through to the top tier and decided to stop before she spent years chasing a dream that wasn't going to happen. Athletes retire quietly all the time. Malcolm Hendry could have been exactly what he appeared to be, a mid-level coach who traveled because that's what coaches do, who worked for a consulting firm because he needed supplementary income, who went to Berlin and Prague because he was networking, scouting, doing the unglamorous labor of sports management in an era before agents and academies professionalized the field. Lydian Services could have been a boring consulting firm that happened to have some government contracts and happened to share office space with a sports agency. Brass plate companies are often just tax shelters or legal conveniences, not spy fronts. And the woman buried as June Hendry in 1947 could be a different person entirely, or could be June Mercer, who married Malcolm Hendry, no blood relation, just the same surname, and died young of tuberculosis or pneumonia or any of the diseases that killed young people before antibiotics became widespread. All of this is possible, all of this fits the evidence, and all of this is dramatically less interesting than the alternative. Which raises the question, why do we want the conspiracy to be true? Because there's something seductive about hidden patterns, about the idea that what we see is not all there is, that beneath the surface of the ordinary, a tennis tournament, a sports contract, a quiet retirement, there are wheels within wheels, secrets and substitutions, a world of shadows that only the initiated can perceive. The June Mercer case gives us permission to believe that history is more interesting than it appears, that a mid-ranked tennis player from Bristol might have been a courier for British intelligence, moving through pre-war Europe with messages sewn into her racket strings, that a coach was a handler, that a tournament was a cover, that the woman who lost in the semi-finals at Roland Garros was not who she claimed to be. It's a good story. It has the structure of a Le Carre novel, the athletic cover, the substitution, the disappearance, the unanswered questions. It fits our understanding of how intelligence services operate, the tradecraft of the era, the desperation of the late 1930s when war was coming and every border crossing was a potential dead drop. But good stories are not the same as true stories. And the evidence, such as it is thin. 2 photographs that might show different people. A coach with unexplained travel. A career that ended without explanation. These are fragments, not proof. Suggestions, not certainty. The truth about June Mercer may be lost to time. The records are incomplete. The witnesses are dead. The operation, if there was an operation, was designed to leave no trace. We're left with what we have, 2 photographs. Some travel records, a name in a business directory, a grave in Bristol, and the question of whether we're looking at history, or just at our own reflection in a grainy photograph, seeing what we want to see. The June Mercer case remains open, not because the evidence demands it, but because the story refuses to let go.